Hi everyone, so today we're looking at dot points P9 and P14, and basically they're not sequential, they're not next to each other, but they're related, so I've put them together. And we have P9, which is describing how light, temperature, available moisture, oxygen and carbon dioxide, wind and biotic factors or living factors affect plant growth, development and production. And then the second one is explaining how farmers can manage plant production systems to overcome environmental constraints. Now, all these things listed here are all environmental constraints. So the second dot point is looking at how we can manage each one. So the first one, light. Obviously, light is an input to photosynthesis. So for a plant to be able to photosynthesize, it needs light. And so here we have a graph down the bottom showing the amount of light intensity or the kind of strength of the light and the rate of photosynthesis. And you can see that as the light gets stronger, you get rate of photosynthesis increasing and increasing up to a point where doesn't matter how much more intense the light gets, the photosynthesis is already at a maximum and it won't go any higher. You can also see here as a bit of extra information the light absorption by plant leaves of different colors or different parts of the plant leaf. But basically, plants use only some wavelengths of light for photosynthesis, and some colors are reflected. So obviously, green light is reflected because we can see it. So plant leaves reflect green back at us, which is why we can see it as green. And other parts of the spectrum are absorbed by the plant and used for photosynthesis. So plants are also affected by the intensity of light, and light inside a house can have a lower intensity than outside because it's being filtered through glass. So that is important if you're growing plants indoors or outdoors. Many plants have a light requirement for flowering, and you can see here we've got short day, long day, and day neutral plants. And these plants, basically, depending on what they are, will flower at different times of the year when they get short days or long days or whatever. So they flower at, in summer or winter or that kind of thing. Obviously, during summer we have longer days, and during winter we have shorter days. This is known as photoperiodism, and the critical period is the length of the dark time, and that determines when the plants flower and which plants are going to grow at which time of year and which season. So in terms of, this is the P14 part of it, the P14 dot point, how we can manage light. So obviously, first of all, you can grow plants that are suited to the climate. So C4 plants are typically suited to tropics where there's longer day lengths because they are more efficient at using light and they have a longer day period. Obviously, you could also install artificial lighting, such as in a glass house like this, and you could lengthen the time or the amount of daylight, which will lead to more production. But you'd have to be doing that with a fairly high value crop because obviously the electricity or the energy used to power the lights is quite expensive. So you'd really need to be getting a good return from that. And so it would need to be a high value crop for that. Our second environmental constraint is air temperature. So obviously different plants have different optimum and minimum maximum temperatures that they grow in, and we know that because different plants grow in different regions at different times of year, and they prefer different temperatures. And so they, like any chemical reaction, photosynthesis is a chemical reaction, and basically every chemical reaction has an optimum temperature where it works best at and it's most efficient. And so it's the same with plants and photosynthesis. Different plants have a different ideal temperature range and optimum and minimum maximum. So as we said, there's an optimum, minimum, maximum. So examples here are lucerne, which is a photo of here. The minimum is 1, maximum is 38, and an optimum temperature of about 30, compared to wheat, which likes a kind of lower optimum and maximum. It has a higher minimum as well. A minimum of 4, a maximum of 32, and an optimum of 25, and you can see wheat here. So in terms of how we manage air temperature, again, as with light, you choose a species that is suited for that area at that time of year. You can't grow wheat in Queensland in summer, for example, but you can grow it in winter down south in western New South Wales, for example, because it likes that certain temperature range. You can also regulate temperature in glass houses, and you can have sensors in there which can open up, turn on fans and change the temperature inside the glass house. You could also use shade cloths and plastic covers around plants to reduce the amount of light the plant is getting, and therefore manage the air temperature. Constraint number three, soil moisture. Obviously, moisture or water is also required for plants to photosynthesize, and most crops rely on natural rainfall to supply the moisture, and farmers are concerned with total rainfall, so they need to have a good amount of rainfall. They also need to have it in the right season, which is seasonality, depending on what crop they're growing. Reliability, that means, is it going to come in February? If you plant something and you need water in February, is it likely to come every year? Some years, not very reliably. That's important. And then lastly, the effectiveness, the amount left after rainfall. So if you get, say, 200 millimeters of water in an hour, or let's say in 2 hours, that is going to be ineffective because it's going to run off. There's just so much water so quickly, it will run off. But if you get that 200 millimeters over, say, 2 weeks, it's going to be far more effective because there will be time for the water to soak into the soil and the soil profile, and that way it'll be far more effective. Waterlogging, on the other hand, also reduces crop yield growth, depresses flowering and nodulation of legumes as well. So too much and too little water is a problem. And of course, as we said, as water is an input for photosynthesis, if you have limited water, you have a limited photosynthesis. And so there's ways of checking the moisture. You could have soil moisture probes that can go down a couple of meters, and you can put them around your farm, and they can remotely tell you how much water there is in different areas at different depths. And you can even hook this up to, say, irrigation, which could automatically irrigate. So in terms of management and the P14 part of the dot point, or P14 dot point for this constraint, obviously management of soil moisture is basically irrigation. And there's multiple different methods here. We've got flood irrigation, which we do in Australia with rice and cotton in particular. We've got drip irrigation, which is far more efficient, wastes far less water, and it can be used in horticultural crops. And then there's also, you could put organic matter like mulch and that kind of thing over soil to actually retain the moisture that is put in there instead of having it lost to the atmosphere. So those are multiple ways of maintaining or managing soil moisture. Carbon dioxide and oxygen. So plants actually need carbon dioxide again as an input for photosynthesis. And so you can see here carbon dioxide concentration is only about 0.03%. So there's not a lot of carbon dioxide in that atmosphere. And so it is reduced if you've got a rapidly growing crop that is highly dense, then there can be a limit on the amount of carbon dioxide that each individual plant can get. And it can also be reduced in a glass house because obviously the environment and the air in there is a bit more controlled. So carbon dioxide can become a problem. And you can see here that for this photo, it's a good example. Carbon dioxide at 380 parts per million, which is kind of low. It's, I guess, a little bit lower than the atmosphere normally. And so here we have carbon dioxide at a seriously high rate, very high rate, 1850 parts per million, which is very high in a glass house. And you can see the difference in the growth just from changing carbon dioxide and nothing else. So ways that you can manage carbon dioxide is you can plant densities, you can plant crops at slightly lower density to allow more taking in of carbon dioxide by each plant out in the field. Or if you're in a glass house, you can ensure more ventilation, or you can install things like carbon dioxide generators, which will create carbon dioxide in the glass house. Constraint number 5, wind. So wind can obviously, if it's very strong, can uproot trees and crops and plants, which is obviously going to kill them. But it can also alter rates of transpiration. So it helps remove the boundary layer and it means of the leaf, and it means that water vapor is going to leave the surface more quickly, and so it's going to lead to more transpiration, more water loss. And that if it doesn't have as much water, that's going to decrease photosynthesis because obviously water, as we said, is an input for photosynthesis. So basically, on a farm in a paddock, the only way of reducing wind is planting windbreaks. And you can see a diagram here. You might have a 30 mile per hour wind. If you plant a windbreak, it forces the wind to go up and over. And underneath the windbreak here, it's reduced to 5 miles per hour, and even a fair way out, it's still down to 10 from 30. So a windbreak is ideal for both stock but also for plant growth. The last constraint here is biotic factors, and this means living things, in this case pests and diseases. And so there's 4 main ways that living things can affect plants, and basically these are the four here. So they can eat or damage the leaves, and we've got example cabbage white butterfly moth, which is here. We also have birds, of course, can eat leaves and stems. Number 2 is sucking the sap or the juice out of a plant. So this is what the plant produces during photosynthesis. And if an aphid, for example, which is here on this photo, sucks the sap from the plant, that's going to reduce its ability to grow or to put on dry matter. The next one here, damaging the roots or stems. So this example here is a root rot that has damaged the stems of this crop here because it wasn't in rotation. This crop here had a rotation, and so it's growing better. You can see the green color is better because the roots are functioning better. Take-all fungus is another example of a disease that attacks the roots. And lastly, the production can be reduced by attacking the harvested product. An example here is weevils, which eat stored grain when it is stored. The way that we can manage this, so the P14 part of this, the way we can manage biotic factors is the easiest way, of course, is IPM, or integrated pest management, using physical, chemical, biological, and cultural examples, and you should be well aware of that. This is just a summary of what I've just said, and you've got the P9 dot point here, which is the effect of those things on the growth and development, and then you've got the P14 dot point here, which is the way that we overcome those things. Down here with some past questions, explain how farmers can manage plant production systems to maximize photosynthesis. So I first outlined or gave 2 examples of things, so CO2 and light, and then went on to say that CO2, because it's explained, CO2 is required by plants as an input for photosynthesis. It can be limited in a dense, young, fast-growing crop or in a glass house with low ventilation. Farmers can manage this to maximize productivity by reducing the density of the crop, which improves CO2 levels per plant, or by using CO2 generator, which can increase CO2 level in the glass house and hence maximizing photosynthesis. On the other hand, light can also be a limiting factor by choosing appropriate plants for the climate, examples C4 plants in tropical region, and incorporating artificial lighting in a glass house. This can increase the day length and amount of light the plant receives and therefore maximize the level of photosynthesis occurring. So I've explained how that can be managed and given examples as well. This one here, which of the following is not an example of overcoming an environmental constraint in plant production? Adding lime to acidic soils. pH is an environmental feature. Growing crops in a glass house as temperature is environmental. Covering fruit trees with bird netting. Birds are a pest or a biotic factor, which is environmental. And applying hormones to cuttings to promote root growth is something humans have done, and it's not considered an environmental factor. Which of the following graphs accurately shows the effect of light intensity on photosynthesis? So the answer here is this one, C. And what's going to happen is as light intensity increases, photosynthesis increases to a maximum or an optimum here, and then it just flatlines. Now, the important point to this here is that this is not talking about temperature. So normally we would associate, more light and more sun with more temperature, and so this is just asking about the intensity of light, assuming that the temperature stays the same. If this instead said temperature, the answer would be this one, and it would go up, maximum, optimum, and then it would drop back down as it got hotter because the plant can't photosynthesize as it gets hotter. It would drop off. But this is just about light intensity. It's not saying anything about temperature. We're assuming the temperature stays the same, but the light intensity goes up, and the photosynthetic rate would get to a maximum where the plant just can't photosynthesize anymore. It's at peak, 100% of its capacity, and it just flatlines from there. Which environmental factor would be most likely to cause seedlings growing in a greenhouse to appear pale and elongated? Now, they're going to appear pale if they don't get enough sunlight because they're not photosynthesizing, and they're going to appear elongated because they're trying to reach out to find the sun, and they think they're probably underground under the soil, and they're trying to reach up to the surface. And so low light conditions is the answer to that one. Here I've just, this question here is very similar to the previous 6-mark question 2 pages over, and so I've just given you the sample answer here, but it's basically the same question with the same answer as the previous one, and this is also the same question as this one here. So the answer for that is C also.